I am so conservative.
Rationalize in my head. These are things I read in the
I'm going to talk about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had
remembered at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah. I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. I am so conservative.
Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. While some states are open for business, according to Illinois Governor Pritzker, we may be on lockdown for years until either the virus ceases to exist or there's a fully approved, readily available vaccine, or he's ousted from office. At that point, we are freed from house arrest and all of us will emerge from our homes. Will we recognize our extended family and friends? Will social cues need to be relearned? Will anyone notice or even care that I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving? In the meantime, on social media, those who may or may not be new to this webcast still might need a reminder, and this is a trigger warning, that this is not a safe space for those who may be easily offended by having their ideas challenged. Today's May 12th, 2020, and this is broadcast number 189. Joining us this week is our friend, we think is our friend anyway, Dr. Richard G. Howe, to wax eloquent on the topic of presupposing presuppositionalism. My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast, and our senior researcher and co-host and resident COVID-19 tracker is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie, baby.
Good evening, morning, good afternoon. I don't know. It's 1:03 p.m. here. Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm trees came out, saw their shadows, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsors for this program include Jack's General Deconstruction, subverting the best to palm off the rest since 1966. Jack's General Deconstruction and World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet. And if you enjoy this webcast, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on other people, to ensure continued access to this program, please go to midwestoutreach.org. Click the yellow donate button and contribute as you feel led. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. So that brings us back to the program with Dr. Richard G. Howe.
Richard G. Howe, one of my favorite comics, who on part-time basis teaches philosophy.
Well, we learned he's related to our law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. So
yes, his uncle is Howe. And Howe.
Yeah. I have a friend named Jeff Cheatham, and now I just have to find somebody named Dewey, and we have to
do that.
Yeah.
We're off and going. We'll start our own YouTube channel and everything.
I have a friend named Dewey Decimal, but I don't think he's going to.
I'm not even going there.
He's related to Dewey Morning. I like that guy. He's pretty calm, and he's a good guy.
One of the calls I frequently receive or get emails about it is, what is your apologetic methodology? And they're looking or in search of, it seems like, the inspired inerrant apologetic methodology. And you and I have a mutual friend in Dr. Phil Fernandes,
yes,
who has put together a list. So far, he's compiled a list of 17 apologetic methods. And
I need to
Yeah.
get out more often.
Yeah, yeah, he did that at our last conference, actually.
Oh,
So,
wow. Okay.
I gotta get a copy of that. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I can send it to both of you so that you'll be also
Yes.
wise
Yes.
unto apologetics issues.
Is the throwing the brick method including that in that?
No,
list?
no, he's kind of looking at that to see if it can be officially added or not. But
Yeah.
So does he
so,
explain all 17, Don? Does he tell us, or does he just list them as by name? And
no,
you
he
have to guess
well
what they
in the
mean?
workshop he does, and I have a paper. I can send you the paper as well.
I'd love
So,
that. Yeah.
and in fact, I'll see how we can get that out to others. But
All right.
for me, and you know this, I tell everyone I'm a homeschooled apologist. So I don't have a particular methodology. I have the question of what is this person invested in, and how can I interact with that information to get to the gospel? So I don't have a presupposed idea of anything.
What that word mean?
Well,
You're
but
you're already causing trouble, Don.
I know, and I'm gonna even create more trouble, because one of the things I'm going to say, and I believe Richard would concur with this, and Ron, you probably would as well, is if you are going to make your case, particularly in a public environment, you should think out well in advance what it is that you're going to say. What you do not want is a deer in the headlights moment, or as you are making your case, you suddenly realize, I'm going to say something that I don't want to defend. And we have a case of that where an individual was making a political speech, and as he was referring to the Declaration of Independence, he suddenly seems to have realized that his party had removed God from their party platform.
Mm-hmm. You know the thing.
Well, do you know the thing? So we are going to take a look at what that might look like. And Richard hasn't seen this. So are you ready, Richard?
I'm ready. Yeah, absolutely.
This is great.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by the code. You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
I said, what's the thing?
The thing.
That I know.
You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
I said, what's the thing?
The thing.
That I know.
You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
I said, what's the thing?
The thing.
That I know.
You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
I said, what's the thing?
The thing.
That I know.
You know
The thing.
all men and women created by the thing. All men and women created by the thing. You know the thing.
All men and women created by the thing. All men and women created by the thing. You know the thing. All men and women created by the thing. All men and women created by the thing. You know the thing. Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
I said, what's the thing?
The thing.
That I know. You know the thing. Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
Do I know the thing?
You know the thing.
I said, what's the thing?
The thing.
That I know. You know the thing. All men and women created by the thing. All men and women created by the thing. You know the thing.
You know, every political campaign needs an anthem, and I think she just provided the Biden campaign with its anthem. They really should.
Yeah, she kind of did. Now, I got permission, by the way, Ron. I emailed her yesterday, and I got permission to use this on today's webcast. And we have a link to it in our description box.
Oh, good.
And
I wouldn't think you would need permission because it's already like out there.
I understand, but I wanted to make sure we dotted our I's and crossed our T's. And I thought it would be fun to kind of communicate with her. She is, Richard, you might be interested in this. I sent it on to our friend Jonathan Miles, who teaches philosophy downstate here.
Yeah.
Because she is a philosophy major, I want to say, loves philosophy from a Jewish seminary. She is a music major, multi-instrument artist. And what she does is kind of interesting. And if you go to her YouTube channel, she takes up philosophical issues and puts them to song, like this.
We got to
So-
watch that channel.
Yeah.
That'll be
So-
interesting.
It is advisable to know what it is that you want to say before you begin the process of waxing eloquent, especially in a public forum. Now, having said that, and Jeff Downs is with us today, and he
Excellent.
pointed out that this issue has been addressed over and over again. In particular, there is a response from Eli Ayala over at Revealed Apologetics. And see
Yes,
his
I'm
YouTube
familiar
channel.
with Eli's work.
Okay.
Now, what
Yeah.
issues are you referring to? The one we're talking, our topic?
Presuppositionalism.
Ah,
right,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, who
So-
hasn't? I mean, we've got it. It's been addressed in books like 5 Views on Apologetics.
Okay.
It's been a view. Here's both and a balanced apologetic, which tries to blend evidentialism and
I mean,
presuppositionalism.
R.C. Sproul and Greg Bahnsen had this debate back in the late 70s.
Yeah, well,
Right.
here's the classical apologetics book
There you
by Sproul, Gerstner, and Arthur Lindsley, which seeks to answer Van Tillian and maybe to some extent Clarkian apologetics. I forget, but yeah, there you go.
Okay, one brief thing here. Benjamin's asking for a link to the channel. It is in the description on you're on YouTube. It's in the description box. You can go right there and get it. So, number one, for the uninitiated, we have a presuppositionalist and one who doesn't presume to be a presuppositionalist, I think.
A presumptualistic presumption.
I'm a
Presumptuous.
post-suppositionalist.
He's a
Post-suppositionalist.
He waits and he.
Would one of you, you know what, I'm going to go to Richard and ask you to give a concise description of presuppositionalism, which then Ron can go, no, you're all wrong. But for the
I kind of
uninitiated,
doubt I will do that, but
yeah, for the uninitiated to go, is there something I want to know about? And the answer is maybe not, but listen anyway.
Yeah, well, Van Til defines it basically. This is almost a direct quote that in order to know anything, one must presuppose the existence of the Christian God. And more attenuated, it would be the Trinitarian God of the 66 books of the Protestant Bible, and even more narrow of Reformed theology. So any argument that can conclude the existence of God, in Van Til's estimation, could not be the God of the Bible, since the God of the Bible would have to be the starting point of every argument and could never be merely the conclusion of any argument. So he would also say that he doesn't believe the unbeliever can really know any fact of reality truly, to the extent that he doesn't factor in the truth that God is the creator of that fact and is the ultimate sort of fulcrum against which a fact can be interpreted, or according to which a fact is interpreted. So you have to presuppose the existence of God to know anything, and it's the beginning of all knowledge and wisdom. That's basically a straightforward, I think, definition.
I would just emphasize what you said later. Truly know.
Correct.
He doesn't deny that unbelievers can have some kind of knowledge, but in terms of truly knowing the thing, the object of your knowledge, and it's not just. Do you know
That's
the
right.
thing? So.
Yeah,
You didn't know
even
that.
Van Til was anticipating by decades.
He anticipated that too. And also it wasn't just. I mean, I would want to just make sure it's the God of Scripture that you have to believe in, not just God. You know, which I think you kind of implied by.
It has to be the Trinitarian God, which doesn't mean that you have to, in their estimation, you have to begin your discussion with an unbeliever by a discussion of the Trinity.
Right. And this, of course, now the question I think for a lot of people will be, what does this have to do with apologetics? I mean, okay, do we just lose Don?
No, I'm here. I'm playing around, so I thought I'd take myself out of the picture and let the two better young men do that.
So and so I think what you find is a lot of people arguing online and I don't think, and including the presuppositionalists themselves, arguing that evidences have no place in apologetics, and that's not something even Van Til would say.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, no. Of course they. It's just what place do they have, and within which context epistemologically are those evidences even possible?
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
And so,
although I would say, I don't know what you make of Bahnsen's article, "The Impropriety of Giving Evidence for the Resurrection," the article that he wrote. I think
I never read that one.
I think James Anderson at Reformed Seminary takes a little bit of exception with Bahnsen maybe carrying it a little bit too far, at least in the rhetoric, but that's probably an intramural debate.
Well, yeah, I mean, Bahnsen carried some things too far. When I think of theonomy, that's one of them. I don't remember. I didn't read that particular article. He debated an atheist. The name escapes me.
He debated Gordon Stein and also George Smith, both.
I'm not sure if those. Well, the person he debated came totally prepared to debate on the basis of the kinds of apologists he had debated before and encountered, which were all evidentialists. And he was just blown away. And he was like one of the few people I've ever heard of who actually said, he won the debate, I lost. At the end of the debate, this atheist said,
"Wow,
Bahnsen, I was totally unprepared for his arguments. I'd never heard anything like them before."
I'd love to get that debate if you know how to.
Yeah, I wish I'll definitely check around. I forget who.
Was it a print or was it a multimedia?
I'm pretty sure it was a live, one of the old-fashioned live debates.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to hear that.
Because really, I mean, what the and to some extent, just not to a great extent, but not to a complete extent, I should say, because Francis Schaeffer had his differences with Van Til, but in terms of his method, it was pretty much, you could say it was informed, I think, by Van Til's apologetic, in that he didn't go right for the evidences. What he did was he tried to show the non-believer the absurdity, the ultimate absurdity of his views. In other words, if you take your view to its logical conclusion, here's where you end up. How should we then live? Can you really live according to your worldview? Which is I'm not saying an evidentialist can't do that. In fact, anybody can do this. But that was his primary approach. So
yeah, and so one of the things that interests me, Don, you had mentioned, I don't know if this was before we got on the air, one of our friends and fellow apologists had cataloged up now 17 methods, so to speak. Right. One of the things I'm curious to see, if you will send me that list, is I would typically confine the methods to those things that distinguish them from each other. So very often what I hear in this conversation is somebody come along and go, well, what I like to do with apologetics is X, Y, Z. And they pick out something that none of the methods fail to do. Like for example, they might say, well, I like to address people and start where they are. Well, nobody doesn't do that. The presuppositionalist does that. The classical does that. Maybe the Fideist doesn't do that. I don't know. But
yeah.
So what I think is important is just to focus on, well, what distinguishes the methods and instead of what unites them, at least as far as trying to understand the different methods.
And it's very difficult to come. In fact, if I were to make one recommendation, I find many books on this topic are very tough going for the average person.
Right.
For the lay person, and I would include in that list this book here. It's called Every Thought Captive. Look at how thin it is. Look at how skinny it is.
I've got a very old edition of that.
It's called A Study Manual for the Defense of Christian Truth. I actually bumped into Richard Pratt in the Orlando airport several years ago, quite by accident. I mistook him for, of all people, who's that? The Arminian evidentialist. I forget his name. I'm
sure he appreciates that. You got him wrong on two counts.
I actually totally blew it. He was working William Lane Craig. I actually mistook him for William Lane Craig because for a while William Lane Craig was sporting a beard, and I saw Richard Pratt from the side. He was sitting in the airport typing on his Apple laptop, his Mac laptop, and I go, "Are you William Lane Craig?" "No, I'm Richard Pratt." I go, "Oh, it's just like that's a big bozo no."
So we want to bring it back here.
Yeah, I'm bringing it back here. Here's the book. I would recommend getting this book and going straight to the appendix. It's sort of an appendix. It's called An Apologetic Parable. It's actually the final lesson in the book. It's like, this book isn't even 150 pages, I don't think. Page 133, almost the end of the book. An Apologetic Parable, where it is discussing a Christian who's trying to, he goes by the name of Defenseless Danny. And he tries to get he tries to get someone to help him witness to his non-Christian friends. And he gets 3 different apologists, 3 different people with 3 different methods. And of course, this is a parable, and it's kind of exaggerated, and it's describing a narrative that probably would never happen in real life. But you get a flavor for, because the third guy he picks is a presuppositionalist. Now, to the author's credit, to Dr. Pratt's credit, the presuppositionalist doesn't magically convert the married couple that are non-believers. It's not like he presents it as though suddenly they finally got an apologetic method that miraculously converts people. There is no such thing. But you can see the difference in the outcomes, and I think they pretty much follow. When you're dealing with informed people, this married couple were portrayed as informed non-believers. Not everybody's informed. So an evidential approach, I've talked to people who said an evidential approach was very instrumental in leading them to the faith. And so I don't dispute that. I don't downplay it. I don't want to demean it. But I would recommend just getting this book and reading, go straight to the last chapter, and then go back to the beginning and start reading. It'll help you.
So one of the questions coming in is by Jeff Downs, who's, from what he's writing, and I assume this is the case, he's also, well, I'm not going to get into what his theological bent is at the moment, but tends toward presuppositionalism. Let's presuppose he's a presuppositionalist. We know Ron is. He's already, proudly announced that fact. And you have been debating presuppositionalist. Why is that important, especially to those who don't even understand what the issues are between various apologetic methods?
Yes. Well, there's probably an analogy. Suppose instead of apologetic method, we were talking about evangelistic messages or methods. So that we could, I can't imagine what some might be, but, somebody said, well, I think you should just cold call people out on the street with the 4 spiritual tracts, and others say, no, it's better to have a big event and bring lost people in with music.
Or do a Ray Comfort, confront somebody on the beach.
People have these different, they may have different ways of doing evangelism. And so just as with that debate, why it's important is because evangelism is important. By analogy, then, the same issues apply to apologetics. That is to say, apologetics used to be referred to as pre-evangelism, where it tried to deal with intellectual obstacles that may be preventing people from even beginning to understand what the gospel message is. So you have to go back to their whatever they are assuming falsely or whatever kind of methods they have in their own thinking, and address those barriers that are barriers to them understanding the gospel. And another thing too, I think is important to keep in mind that, and maybe this betrays a little bit of my theology, but I think it's fair to say that when it comes to a person coming to faith, that's not even the object of apologetics. Apologetics can never affect faith in anybody. That's
Mhm.
only done between them and God through the work of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
And I think you can say that with generically enough that it doesn't try to adjudicate between the Arminian, the Calvinists, and others. So oftentimes, the reason I bring it up, because sometimes people will point out the failure of some method because people didn't come to faith. You go, well, that's not the criterion to judge its viability as much
Right.
as, because whether that happens or not is just like evangelism doesn't always result in everybody getting saved when they hear the gospel. But it doesn't mean the evangelist shouldn't preach the gospel as much as possible. And again, by analogy, the apologist has to do his apologetics. Another thing that makes this significant is it really isn't just merely an academic dispute. It's a practical one, in as much as the presuppositionalist will say that the classical, as opposed to the evidentialist, I wouldn't consider myself an evidentialist strictly, but I'm classical, and there's a distinction to be drawn. But the evidentialist will say that the classical method is unbiblical and ungodly in a sense, because it's illicitly conceding to the lost person some kind of neutral ground or whatever that doesn't exist. And so it's sort of an insult. And as Van Til said, if I give, let's say, one of Aquinas's arguments for the existence of God, then according to Van Til, the God that I conclude there can't be the God of Christianity. So those are pretty high stakes, because he's in effect saying my method cannot end up concluding the truths that it was setting out to try to demonstrate. Whether that's the case or not, that's at least what's at stake in the debate over method.
Mm-hmm. As I read Van Til, he's saying that's as far as Aquinas's 5 ways can take you. They can take you to a God that could be the same as. He's never read Aquinas, apparently, because the arguments that Aquinas gives right at the beginning of the Summa Theologia demonstrates all of the classical attributes of God. It doesn't demonstrate the Trinity, because he would be of the opinion, as I'm of the opinion, that the Trinity is a matter of revealed truth, not natural theology. Right. So when you demonstrate a being who is simple, immutable, omniscient, all-powerful, all-loving, all good, all wise, and all of these superlative attributes, that has to be the God of the Bible, because there's only one God. And if your argument can demonstrate these attributes, there can't be another being with these attributes, because it just is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But you're saying he doesn't push it all the way to the Trinity?
Not in his natural theology, no.
Or you mean Aquinas doesn't push it all
Correct.
The way to the Trinity?
Aquinas doesn't push.
But Van Til does, right?
No, not in his. No, he presupposes that. He doesn't push an argument to that.
No, I'm just saying he says it would be. You can't get to the God of the Trinity through the 5 ways.
Yeah, you get through the God of the Trinity through revealed truth.
Right.
According to Aquinas, and I think he's absolutely right about that.
So here's something I want to pose that you might think about for a moment. And it goes like this: what if you run into someone you want to start with a presuppositional position, let's say, but what if you meet with somebody who says, you can't even know truth, you have to deconstruct what previous authors have written?
It's just self-refuting.
And we have a sponsor that deals with this issue.
So we have some questions for you, and that is, are you having difficulty living according to your worldview? Do you need expert professional help to get reality to conform to your presuppositions? Sometimes, do you feel like you don't know Jack? Well, then, you should call Jack. And we're talking about Jack of Jack's General Deconstruction. All Jack's work comes with free logocentrism inspection, free binary opposite inversion, free destabilization of textual meaning. Now you can have the reality that suits you. Subverting the best to palm off the rest since 1966, Jack's General Deconstruction. So, speaking of presuppositions, this is what one of our sponsors deals directly with that.
I don't want to offend our sponsors at all.
No, we don't want to do that.
Yeah, we do. We don't mind offending our sponsors.
Our sponsors.
We'll offend anybody.
Yeah.
Sorry,
equal opportunity offenders. Yeah. So we can see how seriously we take this. Okay, so where were we?
Well, you're kind of laying out the various kinds of views and why they're important, and I think Richard's point is well taken, because there's a variety of evangelistic methods, and there's obviously a variety of apologetic methods. Is one of them sinful and the other one inspired? As you're debating this issue with presuppositionalists, kind of where do you take that? How do you deconstruct their idea or address your concerns about their ideas, let's say?
So it depends on the particular presuppositionalist. I recently had the privilege of participating in a panel discussion with the Tag You're It gentleman, Ray Cockburn, I think. I hope I don't get his last name incorrect, and Dave Van Beber. And so it depends on whether they want to frame the argument in terms of the failings of the classical method, in which case I would try to define what the classical method is and defend that as, in effect, undeniable, or whether they frame the argument in terms of an exegetical issue. Hey, look what Paul did in Acts on Mars Hill, and so we extrapolate a method from that. And I think the former is more productive, because I think a lot of the issues that divide the two methods are philosophical. They're not exegetical. Just like disputes about the attributes of God are not ultimately exegetical, because the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen, being understood through the things that are made, Paul says in Romans 1, instead of being understood through a careful exegesis of the scripture. Not that exegesis of the scripture is not relevant to things like the attributes of God, but it's not determinative of that, because we'd have to be able to know what God's nature is enough in order to know when the Bible is speaking metaphorically about it.
But I think what that passage does for us exegetically, I think you'd agree with this, is that when we encounter people who say they don't see any evidence of God in creation, and we see them all over the place, what that passage is telling us is those people are lying. Those people they think they're telling the truth, but they have suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. I like to tell this story. It comes from my sophomore year in high school. It took me a while to see it to see the connection between this and what Paul says in Romans 1. But in high school, this is back in the days of overhead projectors. I might have to get a picture of one of those to show some of our younger webcast viewers. They're not quite. They don't go quite back to the days of clay tablets or just the chalkboard that you put. Yeah, or the abacus. Yeah, they don't go quite but far, but they were pretty primitive compared to what we have today. Our biology teacher had a really amazing set of overheads for the human body. And so he puts, one day in class, he puts on an overhead for the respiratory system. Now, the respiratory system is an amazingly complex system in and of itself, and it has to connect to the circulatory system and so on. The next day he puts up the circulatory system, and this goes all through your body. It's amazingly complex. The next day he puts up the nervous system, okay? And that, likewise, it's a parallel system to the circulatory. It goes all throughout your body, connects everything together. Without any one of these systems, you would die. The next day he puts up something I was totally unprepared for. Now, at this point, I am a self-declared agnostic. I'm raised Roman Catholic, but I'm telling all my friends I'm an agnostic. He puts a diagram of the lymphatic system on the overhead. I had never seen a diagram of the lymphatic system until my sophomore year. It blew me away. It was just as complex as all the other systems. And likewise, it runs through your entire body, and without it, you would die. And I remember, to this day, I remember the thought that went through my head sitting in that classroom in 1975? It's like, how could this have just happened? How could this have just evolved? And I remember the next thought I had in my mind. I said, I'm not going to think about that. I'm sure somebody will explain it to me someday. I'm just not going to think about it. I suppressed the truth in unrighteousness, and I
What's
chose.
interesting, though, Ron, is I hear that a lot from presuppositionalists, something to the effect that there are no atheists, for example, because everybody suppresses the truth, as Romans 1:18 and 21 say. But they need to go on and finish the chapter of Romans, because the argument Paul's making begins with this: we all know God, assuming that he's talking generically about the human race and not exhaustively about the human race, which, by the way, because this is an aside point, the argument in Romans 1 ultimately says that it ends up in homosexuality, but I don't even know any presuppositionalist who thinks every professing atheist is actually homosexual.
And I don't think any.
I don't see
that. I don't see that as a logical.
The rest of the chapter. They don't go through the rest of the chapter. So it starts with we know God and has suppressed the truth. But then it says in verse 23, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God, the corruptible creation, and then they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. And then the punchline is they did not retain the knowledge of God. So it isn't the case that they're lying necessarily when they say they don't believe in God. They're fulfilling exactly what Paul's argument is. And that's why in Galatians, Paul called the Galatians, before they were saved, he called them atheists. Literally, that's the word that he uses. So,
Adam Tucker made a point, which is something you kind of are going after as well, Richard. And that is that the fact that it's clearly seen, in other words, there's evidence everywhere you look, doesn't mean that the onlooker is actually clearly seeing it at the moment. You can look at things directly and still miss the import of it.
But that's not what Paul's saying. What Paul's saying is they see it and they deny it.
Right.
But it's a process, as Richard laid out.
That's right. Ron's right. They suppress, they know God, it says in verse 21, and they suppress that knowledge. But as I was arguing, that's the beginning of his point, which I think gets left out of this dispute. They keep saying, well, everybody's suppressing the truth of the knowledge that they have of God. Go, no, it's worse. They've actually jettisoned that knowledge of God.
Well, it says they have exchanged the truth of God for a lie.
And then it says they did not consider retaining the knowledge of God.
Right. Well, yeah, but can you stop knowing something? Is Paul really saying that? I don't think he is.
Well, if he's not, he may not be speaking exhaustively any more than the homosexuality is. Every atheist is a homosexual.
I don't think I don't see how you get from that to there. I don't see how you get. I don't think he doesn't. I don't see how you get from the denial of the suppressing the truth and unrighteousness to every one of the sins in the catalog that Paul enumerates at the end of the chapter. I don't see a connection there.
Notice the common denominator between all five of those is this issue of the knowledge of God. That's we knew God,
but you can go
we changed the glory, we exchanged God for the lie, and then we got rid of the knowledge.
Yeah, and God gave them up because of that. God gave them up to these things.
Right.
These things were not the natural. I mean, these things. You could say, each one of them, in one way or another, is a natural outworking of the denial of the knowledge of God. But does it necessitate that each one of them would be the path that the person making the denial would choose, or could they choose some of them or all of them? I don't think.
Yeah. So, but the classical is not the one saying everybody knows God. They're just merely suppressing.
Oh, I know
they're
that.
the ones making the universal statement. I go, people weren't even retaining the knowledge of God, so it's not apparently universal.
Well, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. They did not see, what does it say? They did not see, although they knew God, did not honor him as God. I'm looking for the how Paul uses the word know. And we do have to acknowledge that the word know has flexibility of meaning, but in this particular context, it says, so they did not see fit to acknowledge God. I'm looking for the verse where it talks about retaining the knowledge of God.
That's verse 28.
That's what okay. So now in my translation, at least the one I'm looking at, ESV says, did not see fit to acknowledge God instead of retain the knowledge. Let's see how it looks in the Greek and in other translations. epigenose. So they did not see fit to acknowledge God. They did not. The NIV retained the knowledge of God. The New American Standard acknowledge God any longer. Yeah, it's kind of like, does this verse really say they jettisoned actual knowledge from their minds? I think, let me just explain now. Of course, my experience does not determine theology, but
I'm glad of that.
because we'd be in a real problem. We'd have, but if I could interpret my experience in the light of what Paul's saying, and if I'm doing it accurately, what I did was I saw something that gave me a basis for knowledge. It informed me that this could not have happened without God, without a creator. And I immediately decided I did not want to go down that path. I did not want to follow where the evidence led. I knew where, I could see right away where it was leading. I just said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to wait until I get a really good atheistic or agnostic explanation for how this could have happened. And in the meantime, I'm not even going to think about it. I'm going to suppress that knowledge. Frankly,
don't you think, Ron, though, these issues we're talking about are not apologetic relevant directly? When you talk about someone's moral response to God in terms of whether they do or don't believe or whatever, that's the work of the Holy Spirit in them. That's not the task of the apologetics to facilitate faith. It's not possible to do that.
Okay. I'm not sure what, I mean, okay, I hear two different things here. Is it connected to apologetics? Or that's one question. The other question is, can we persuade people with apologetics to become Christians? That's another question. As a presuppositionalist, I hardly say, no, we can't. We can't, we can't argue people into the kingdom.
Yeah, I agree with that.
However, as someone who, a Reformed Christian, who believes very strongly in the providence of God, can God use just about anything and everything to bring people to faith? And my answer is yes, and that would include evidentialist arguments. In other words, even if I were to say it's a poor argument, and I'm not even saying that. I'm not even saying evidentialist arguments are poor. Some of them are great. A lot of them are great arguments. But if there's something wrong with using it, even though that may be the case, God can still use it to bring people to faith. In his providence, he uses a...
What's wrong with using it?
I frankly say that there are some times when, if that's the question the unbeliever is presenting, then sure, go there. I won't say, well, you know what, you're asking the wrong question.
That's what's right with using it. I was asking you what's wrong with using it. You were just giving me an example of the time when it's right to use it.
There can be times when it's just not the question that's being asked by the person.
Well, I mean, that has nothing to do with the method. Anybody can make those kind of mistakes as far as they're sort of just these.
Well, okay, so I would agree that if it depends on how you present the evidence. And I do share Van Til's concern with conceding the ground. Okay, in other words, implicitly saying, you're right. If I can't persuade you on the basis of these evidentialist arguments, then I'm losing the debate. I don't concede that. I concede what I would say is, I will present the evidences, but I'm presenting them to somebody who really can see them without my presentation. In other words, you don't need me to come along and give you this stuff.
All right, so let me. Are you going to try to cue up something, Don? I don't want to interrupt you.
Yes, you do.
Go ahead, interrupt.
I just want to ask Ron a question when it's time again.
Okay.
It's whenever. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to float this back out here again because Jeff did ask it, and does everything evidence God's existence? If it does, they don't get rid of that knowledge, as Dr. Howe seems to be implying. Are you implying?
I didn't imply that. I was just quoting Romans 1:28. I didn't imply anything.
I don't really think. I don't think that verse. I think it's pushing that verse to say that.
That's fair. That may be. I may be misinterpreting the verse. That's I'm just saying it looks plain to me that they did not retain the knowledge of God. So, but that may be an ancillary point. I think it would be profitable to get back to the core, because one of the core issues of presuppositionalism is that this came out explicitly in Bahnsen's debate with R.C. Sproul. And it's the difference between what are the ontological preconditions for knowledge and the epistemological preconditions of knowledge. And Bahnsen himself rightly acknowledged in the debate that both sides, the classical and the presuppositionalist, acknowledge that God is the ontological precondition of knowledge. Obviously, if he's the creator, if there weren't, wait a minute, let me make sure the point doesn't get lost.
I'm going to support what you're saying, but go ahead.
All right. So both sides agree that God is the ontological. What distinguishes the two models is that the presuppositionalist says, but no, God is the epistemological precondition of knowledge. All right. So what my challenge is, and this is what I asked the gentleman in the Tag You're It, and I've asked every presuppositionalist with whom I've had the pleasure of interacting on this, I said, I can understand the arguments showing that God is the ontological. What is the argument showing that God is the epistemological precondition of knowledge? Every time I've ever heard anybody give an answer who's a presuppositionalist or have read when they start to say, here's the argument for God being the epistemological, every time they give the argument for God being the ontological precondition. And I've got pull quote after pull quote from Van Til, Bahnsen, Don Collett, Jason Lyle, all these guys, where sometimes within the same paragraph, they'll go from saying the presupposition of God is the precondition of knowledge to God is the precondition of knowledge. Well, God is different than the presupposition of God. And I've never seen any argument, well, why must the unbeliever presuppose God in order to know whether the sun is shining or not?
Okay, I have to say I didn't come prepared for this. I consider myself a presuppositionalist, but I don't make it my main, bailiwick in terms of studies. So I'm going to wing this, okay, at the moment here.
That's better than anything else I've gotten so far.
And I'm going to say that, first of all, let's talk about the difference between an ontological and an epistemological.
Okay, now, for the average person, what is ontological? Right. What is epistemological? So they don't go away going, I have no idea what they're talking about.
Ontological has to do with the subject of being, okay? Epistemological has to do with, let's first say knowledge.
How do we know stuff?
Warranted belief has become a popular phrase thanks to Alvin Plantinga.
I reject the Plantinga stuff, just for the record.
But it's okay. We'll call it. The Bible calls it knowledge. Okay, that we can know certain things. Some philosophers will say it's, when we talk about that, we're talking about a warranted belief. A warranted belief, the problem with that, of course, is that it's warranted, but it may not be true. So in other words, it just makes you look reasonable. That's what warranted belief does. So what we're talking about is, okay, so we're saying in terms of the ontological argument for, say it again, please. I don't want to misstate what you were saying.
It's just whether it's the difference between the ontological preconditions of knowledge.
Precondition for knowledge.
And then the epistemological preconditions of knowledge.
So, and the ontological precondition is that God exists, therefore we can know. Is that a good way of putting it?
Because he's the creator of everything.
Right.
So both sides agree to that.
So the epistemological would have to be something like, I acknowledge God exists, therefore I know. Does that make sense? In other words,
one more time.
I acknowledge the existence of God. I retain God in my knowledge. Therefore, I can know these other things. I can know the sun is shining. I can know 1 + 1 = 2. I can know blah, blah, blah. I really think that this is my understanding of what presuppositionalists are saying, is that to some extent, everybody presupposes the knowledge of God in order to make sense of those things at some level. And we're not talking about just knowing that. We're not talking about the raw data of knowing that 1 + 1 = 2, or the raw data that the sun is shining. We're talking about truly knowing. Okay, we're talking about, in other words, when you know 1 + 1 = 2, you don't just know the fact of the equation. what you know is that there's an orderly universe. You know that,
But that's not really true, though. I mean, it'd be like arguing oxygen is a precondition for breathing, but the presupposition of oxygen isn't. Lots of people breathe that don't even know what oxygen is, and they have no concept of oxygen.
Now we've moved it out of the realm of what's in my head to what's in my lungs.
What I'm saying is I'm trying to presuppose a fact of reality and one's supposition of that fact of reality. Obviously, it has to be a fact that there is a God before we can have knowledge.
Right.
But it's not only not obvious. I've never heard the argument, but why must one presuppose that it's a fact? It has to be a fact, but there are lots of things that can be facts without me supposing anything about it. Like
what you're supposing is that there is something that accounts for
something.
The order of the universe. That there's something that accounts for the order of the universe.
That's right. That's an ontological statement. That's what I'm trying to get you to see. You're reverting back to what has to be the case.
Okay, but
not what has to be the presupposition of the case.
But everybody who sees order in the universe, I believe, presupposes that there's something that accounts for it.
No, not necessarily. I mean, that's never been my experience. So lots of people hadn't even thought about that question.
It's always been my experience.
Okay, well, we have.
In other words, you ask an atheist what accounts for the order that you see in the universe. Now,
that's just asking him an ontology. What is the fact of reality that accounts for this? That's the ontological point. What I'm asking is, he has to be able to explain how he knows these things. He has to suppose knowing them. And that's why I've never seen an argument.
You're asking, look, they asked Linus Pauling, why don't you believe in God? And his answer was, because the universe is so amazing and so orderly and so just amazing that in order to believe that there was a creator, actually, he went on to say, it's so amazing I can barely believe that it exists. In order for me to believe that there's a creator, I had to believe there was something greater than what I can barely believe exists just by looking at it. So he denied it on the basis of he couldn't imagine anything greater than the universe. So he's one of the only people I know who didn't even have an ontological. It's like, what is it? What accounts for this universe?
As we're going through here, it occurs to me there's a lot of people that are how do I want to put this under house arrest around the nation, and some of them may be younger and they're being subjected to this by their parents, having to watch this.
Oh no!
And maybe their parents are really conservative, and so how would they have a safe space living in the same environment as their homes? And we have a sponsor that kind of speaks to that issue.
Yeah, the sponsor was addressing the issue of originally of what to do when you go home on vacation, but now it seems like a lot of these poor kids are on permanent vacation. Our friends at World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies and dubious doctrines, other ideas whose time is gone, are presenting the situation to us. So after 4 semesters at your small progressive liberal arts college, you're flying home to visit your red state relatives. You remember to bring your emotional support puppies. You packed all your comfort blankets and pillows. You even remembered your adult coloring books. But it still feels like something is missing. You don't feel safe. What can you do? You need instant safe space. What happened to my font there? It has patented anti-free speech technology. It has guaranteed protection from trigger words, microaggressions, cognitive dissonance, unwelcome thoughts. Feel protected, feel safe with instant safe space from World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. So what I want to do here, I want to get rid of that too. That's my Bible Works program. What I want to do here is make sure I understand what would satisfy your desire to hear an epistemological precondition for knowledge.
What would satisfy it was be to hear or read one. That's what would satisfy.
Okay, I would need to know an example of what would be one. that.
Well, I'm not. I don't know that there is a such thing, but I'm not the one claiming
So
that
what
this
do
is
you
a
believe-
necessary condition for knowledge.
Do you believe there are any epistemological preconditions for knowledge?
I think all of these questions do ultimately philosophically reduce down to truths about the nature of reality that we cannot fail to know as human beings.
So you're saying,
but that's just to state the classical model.
so you're
So in
saying,
effect, what happened? Like, I'll give you an example. When Greg Bonson debated Gordon Stein, and everybody talks about, man, he just demolished the arguments. If a person is, in my judgment, if a person is conversant about the nuances of both models, when Bonson actually tries to start making some of his argument, he's just doing what classical apologetics does.
Right.
He's just making what is called a demonstratio quia argument. He's arguing from a knowable fact, like the sun is shining, and then going backwards to show what had to be true about reality to account for this fact. Well, that is the classical model. That's exactly what classical apologetics does.
so I'm trying to.
I had a situation some years ago where two individuals were newly minted presuppositionalists, had been going to Trinity Seminary right here by me, and one of them called me and said, I really love working with you, and she was very involved with our ministry. I would like you to sit down with my friend and debate presuppositionalism. And I said, well, I'm probably not really the right guy to do that because I don't have a minted way of doing things. I go with whatever's happening in the individual I'm talking to. And so finally I agreed, and I sat down and we ordered something to eat. And I looked at him and I said, okay, so let's start with this. Why should I presuppose your position? And he kind of had that, deer in the headlights look. Because now he had to resort to something other than presuppositionalism.
And it was the thing. That's what it was.
Right.
Well, so to get back to, I'm trying to figure out what do you believe? I asked you if you believed, are there any epistemological preconditions for knowing things like 1 + 1 = 2?
I think probably the closest thing I could imagine is if we were having a discussion about the laws of logic. And so the reason why logic is transcendentally necessary is in order to deny the laws of logic, one has to employ the laws of logic. So it's self-refuting. But that's not true of God. In order for somebody to say there is no God, they don't have to employ God in their argument. They might be able to be unable. It would be the case that they're unable to ultimately account for the existence of the things like logic and stuff that he's talking about in the way that he's talking about. Maybe that's the case. But if that's the case, then you're just doing classical apologetics.
Let's take an example. You said, now I'm going to start with your statement. In order to deny the existence of God, you don't have to employ God in your argument.
Correct.
Okay, here are some various arguments for denying the existence of God that I've heard. I can't believe in God because I can't believe in a God who is all-loving, who would allow the evil to happen. Okay, so right there you have the knowledge of God as presented in Scripture, a loving God who still allows evil to happen. So he's arguing from knowledge about God.
That's not what he's doing. What he's doing is trying to show what he, I think wrongly, thinks is an inconsistency in what he sees us saying.
Right, he's trying to show.
Wait a minute, hang on. He's pointing out what he thinks is an inconsistency in our view. He says the Christian is the one saying that God is all-knowing, all-powerful and all good. And then we both agree that there's evil in the world. We might dispute over what constitutes that evil. So he's not assuming that there is this God. He's just saying it's an inconsistency between your affirmation that God is all-powerful and all good and that there are all these natural evils in the world. So he's not employing God. He's just showing an inconsistency in our view. Just like if I tried to say that some particular politician was a communist and he says, well, and he starts to show an inconsistency between what I think of that politician and what communism actually is. He's just trying to show a sort of an inconsistency in the argument, in our arguments. That's all he's doing. He's not employing God.
So, this is not something I'm used to debating. The normal question when you talk about the epistemological precondition for knowledge is usually more along the lines of to truly know the object.
So what does it mean to truly know something?
To know it in context, in its proper context. In other words, to know.
How big does that context have to be?
Well, it would have to be at least as big as to know that 1 + 1 = 2 is a reflection of the Creator who made the universe.
Yeah.
And so if you are if you don't say that, if you say I basically live in a chaotic universe that has no rhyme or reason to it, there's no sense to it whatsoever.
What is there a Platonist though? What would you say to a Platonist?
In terms of
that he would deny what we would call the God of the Bible as being a personal creator. He doesn't have a notion of creation, but yet he still grounds objectivity of morals and objectivity of logic in the forms. I mean, I don't think that's true, but
I don't see how that's any better. I mean, any more accurate a knowledge of God than someone who says.
I agree that I don't think Plato's right, but the reason I know Plato's not right has to do with the philosophical argument, which is precluded by the presuppositionalist who says, no, that's autonomous human reason. I mean, Ken Ham said you can't use any outside ideas to the Bible. I go, well, the Bible doesn't give you the grammatical historical method of hermeneutics.
I would never cite Ken Ham as a good representative of presuppositionalism.
All right, well, you may be a minority among presuppositionalists, as far as I know, because a lot of people love his method.
Just a quick heads up for those who are watching. We are going to run over, as we pretty much always do, probably about 8 or 10 minutes. So
I'm not against.
I'm just glad I haven't been nursing my water bottle, or we'd have to end early.
Please don't assume that I'm diminishing or demeaning Ken Ham. I appreciate his ministry.
No, I understand. I mean, I would do the same thing. You'd be classical apologists. You could quote that. I'd go, well, I think he's a pinhead.
I don't think Ken Ham's a pinhead.
No, but I'm just saying either of us could pick out representatives from the broad thing that we don't agree with. So I'm not trying to hold your feet to the fire that you got to agree with Ken.
So anyways, it would be probably better if I had a chance to bone up on some of the specific questions you're asking before we try to do this again.
I'll send you an email and try to maybe winnow them down, and you can help me with kind of excavating an answer. For
me, the Romans 1 passage was very, very crucial for me in terms of understanding the apologetic task in general. In other words, who am I dealing with when I'm dealing with an unbeliever? Am I dealing with somebody who really doesn't really know, or am I dealing with somebody who really knows at some level? He just has come up with, as I had, very good arguments, what I thought at least were good arguments for suppressing the truth, for suppressing what was before my eyes. We like an analogy that I could come up with would be conspiracy theorists. I was not there on November 22nd, 1963, but I've been to Dealey Plaza. I've been to the Texas Bookstore Repository. I've been to the floor from which Lee Harvey Oswald is alleged to make the shot. At the time I was there, I had not yet even handled a gun. I have since handled many guns and fired them. And I still agree with what I thought that day when I looked out the window and looked down. I could not believe how small Dealey Plaza looked when I was there. In the pictures, it looks like this big place. And you think, wow, yeah, that would have been a tough shot. Well, I looked at it that day and I said, I've never handled a gun before. I could have made the shot. This was not a hard shot to hit Kennedy. And so right away, immediately, I'm thinking, who are these people? And I began looking at conspiracy theorists regarding the Kennedy assassination. And I've dealt with many conspiracy theorists regarding all kinds of issues. The Twin Towers, was it a red flag operation? Waco, everything. And what this is my view here, is I consistently see people who look evidence right in the face and deny where it should lead them, deny the conclusions to which it should lead them. Now, I'm not saying I have perfect arguments. I'm not saying I know all truth. I'm not saying I'm positive beyond a shadow of a doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy or any of these other things. I'm just saying that, they do not have reasonable arguments.
So help me connect that point, that illustration, with the dispute over the apologetic methodology.
Simply that people will deny the reality that's in front of them. And the reality that's in front of all of us is that God exists and he is responsible for creating everything we see.
All right, so let me say something back to you and tell me if this is fair or if this is a caricature. It sounds like to me you're saying, since it's the case that a lot of people will deny what's right in front of them despite the arguments and evidence you give, then instead of giving arguments and evidence, one should just start with the conclusion, namely you have to presuppose the Trinitarian God of the 66 books of the Reformed Protestant Bible, and then that's the way you do apologetics. Is that? You just have to start.
I don't even really think that's how presuppositionalists work.
That's what they say. That's Van Til's.
Yeah, you start with that presupposition, but is that the way you would have a conversation? I don't know. Have you ever read, or are you aware of Oliphant's book, Covenantal Apologetics?
Yes, I use it as a textbook in my apologetic systems course.
Okay, so then he doesn't, he's definitely more interactive and definitely into meeting people where they are.
Of course.
Right.
I said that early on, that's all of us want to do that and try our best to do that. And by the way, I've had the privilege of being on a panel discussion with Scott and Jason Lyle, the three of us discussing apologetic method. If anybody has trouble falling asleep one night and they want to jump on my YouTube channel.
And this is the thing. It's like we're all trying to reach the lost. And sometimes when earlier you were talking about classical apologetics,
which I never got to give a definition of, by the way.
Well, let me see if
and we should do that because we want to wrap this up in the next 3 or 4 minutes.
I don't run to finish this point if it's all right.
Yeah. Let me make sure I understand. I believe I understand that classical apologetics first tries to establish the existence of God as the ontological presupposition for knowledge, especially knowledge of God, obviously. And then secondly, it proceeds from there to the evidences.
Well, I would say it this way, at least as far as the stripe of classical apologetics I would have as a Thomist, is that there are truths about reality, some truths about reality that no human can, or let me start over. There are truths about reality that humans cannot fail to know.
Okay.
Now, unless they have some of their sensibilities compromised, like, they're blind or they're mentally retarded. I'm just saying a normal, fully functioning human being. There are certain truths about reality that are undeniably true. And from those truths, you can demonstrate the existence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by reason.
Okay, so
that's the model that I would use.
And reason would include evidences, right? You would bring those in as part of in other words, so you use both empirical and rational arguments.
Yeah, in fact, I would say that all reasoning starts from our knowledge of the physical world around us, that what we can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell.
Now, some people would accuse
That's undeniable.
Some people would accuse you of being a Kantian for saying that, but
no. They don't know anything about Kant if they said that. That's Kantian. They might accuse me of being a Lockean, maybe, but it's the difference between modern and classical empiricism. So I'm Aristotelian, Thomist in that regard.
So anyways,
I'm trying to not be incontinent. Or it's a different subject.
We're all grateful for that, by the way.
So I do believe that the definition of classical apologetics was primarily a result of this book. Would you say that?
No.
Would you say that they were using that term before this book came out? Because I
don't know if you're just talking about the way the phrase or the labels are used.
Right. The label.
Yeah.
And I think
the method. I mean, the method goes back as basically to Aristotle.
Right, but I think since this book came out, people have been making a distinction between evidentialism and this. Evidentialism is
because Norman Geisler was making that distinction very adamantly maybe not long, but back into the 70s. I mean, this is not written until the middle 80s.
So then you could say R.C. Sproul popularized, and this book was, here's my point. People today argue that this is an evidentialist textbook.
Yeah.
And
I think
And-
what maybe gets everybody's attention is that R.C. Sproul was himself a covenant theologian and reformed.
Right,
So
right.
his opinion on this arrested a lot more attention
Right.
because it got the attention of the very presuppositionalists who were all of his colleagues. And
And-
he argues, and I think others can argue, that the presuppositionalism of Van Til is a big departure from the Reformed heritage.
I'm trying to make a taxonomical point here because a lot of arguments break down because we're using terms differently. What I've come to understand is that evidentialism is really a different animal from this. Pure evidentialism.
No, it is.
And as I read this book, I come to a place, I have it marked, where the authors all call themselves evidentialists.
Yes.
They say, we are
We use
evidentialists.
those terms interchangeably.
Right. And
He
yet,
did all the way up to the end of his life, in fact.
okay, well, I think most people who go, maybe, and you're being one, you should be able to tell me whether this is true or not. I get the impression that most classical apologists would rather say, I'm a classical apologist than I'm an evidentialist. Because
I would like to think that most of them would do that, but I'm
Right.
not even sure whether most of them would. I think there may be many. I haven't really done a survey, but
Okay.
there may very well be a lot of people who don't even understand what the distinction is between classical
well,
and evidentialism, as far as Geisler set it up, who was my mentor.
I've run into people who probably maybe through Geisler, but they're very adamant on the
Yes.
distinction. They're very adamant.
The Thomists generally are very
I
adamant
want
about a
to
lot of
ask one question, quick answer if you can, and then we have to kind of waltz our way out of here. Jeff Downs posed a question, Dr. Howe, can someone truly deny God's existence?
I don't know what truly deny. If somebody says, I think God does not exist, that seems like a denial of God's existence to me. I don't know what he means by truly. I mean, I can't read people's hearts, neither can we.
Guess if Jeff is if Jeff is a presuppositionalist, and I think Gal's comments seem
he is, yeah.
Calvin's.
Jeff's a really good guy. He's a pastor. He's a presuppositionalist Reformed theology.
Romans 1:28, I take to say exactly that. They did not retain the knowledge of God.
I have a friend who studied under Van Til. He's passed away. His name was Sam Rowan. And he said there was a joke on Westminster, Philadelphia's campus back in the 60s. And the joke went like this: have you read Van Til in the original English? And you know, he's tough to, and you know, I did my master's thesis on John Nelson Darby, and so far he's the only person I've ever met who's more difficult to read than Van Til. Darby is abysmal. He was an abysmal writer. I mean, he was just, it was at least Van Til's sentences are grammatically, structurally correct, which is amazing since he was a Dutchman. But you know, Darby was an Irishman who graduated, you know, with first class honors and from Trinity College Dublin, and he couldn't get English.
I mean, that's why I like what Bonson did in his commentary on Van Til, and then even more what Oliphant is doing. But Bonson didn't necessarily incorporate a lot of things that were important to Van Til.
So the reason I bring
up on those additional overlooked elements in Van Til.
The reason I bring this up is because, as I see it, what's going on here is Van Til would make a statement like, "You can't know, you can't know anything unless you first know God," and the next generation comes by and they say, "Well, you know, I studied under Van Til. What he meant was you can't truly know anything until you know God." And now
that's just as vague as you can't know.
Now we need a qualification of that.
Now you got to talk about truly.
It all gets back to Van Til's style, his very provocative style of communication, which provocative statements tend to be vague. That's what makes them so provocative much of the time.
Well, I would be delighted to find out that real presuppositionalism is something quite different than what Van Til sounded like he was saying. I would be thrilled about that. That's the case.
I've been going through Scott Oliphant's, you know, his version, his fourth edition of Defense of the Faith, and his footnotes are very extensive, and a lot of them are saying, "Here's what he meant," you know, "Here's what he said, here's what he meant,"
okay.
You know.
So, gentlemen, for those who may be intrigued and say, "I need to know about this kind of subject, different apologetical methods," what single source that's understandable to the average layman do you think you could recommend?
I haven't finished writing it yet.
Okay.
Aha.
I was afraid of that.
Now he's looking for a source for what? The
Someone is trying to understand apologetic methods. I mean, if it's someone like me, I'm that's
I'll
just
get
not where I'm at. As you know, Ron, I'm very street level, street fighter kind of a guy.
this book I would recommend for the final chapter. In other words, it's a thin book. I forget how much I paid for it. I was struggling with it until I just flipped to the back chapter and read the parable. It's called an Apologetic Parable, and it compares 3 different methods.
Okay.
And it's a story. It's easy to read, and it's pretty enlightening. So,
Right. I think this is an important topic for those who are already involved in apologetics.
Dr. Howe
I
says,
also think, because it's one of the questions that comes to me from time to time is, what is the best translation of the Bible? And my first response is, whichever one you will read daily.
Yeah, it's like toothpaste. Whichever
Exactly.
one you
Right.
brush your
If you
teeth,
brush
that's
every
the
day.
best toothpaste.
I
Now,
like the ESV, but okay.
Right. After that, I do really actually want to talk about the best translations that are available, but I want one that you're going to utilize, the same as kind of an apologetics. What is it that you can use comfortably to reach non-believers? Because the purpose, as you pointed out right in the beginning, is apologetics is pre-evangelism. It is eliminating objections to the faith. That's what it is. It isn't evangelism in itself. It is preparatory to evangelism.
Yeah,
So having said that, I'm going to be doing something preparatory for Ron to walk us out of here.
Yeah, there you go. And I was anticipating that you might be doing that. So let's give credit to where credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services come from Chef Hammond Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon ND Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polygumus. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys. Oh, to humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Legal advisors are the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc., in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, but you will never, ever be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never happened. And so, Richard and Ron, say goodbye.
Good night. Thank you.
Maybe.